Engamana, engareo, engareo rangatira, onge hoe wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very warm welcome to family, friends, distinguished guests, academic and professional colleagues, students, and to our wider community, to the inaugural lecture of Richard Levy, Professor of Geoscience in the Antarctic Research Centre. Inaugural lectures are one of the more charming, peculiar traditions of universities, where somebody who has given dozens, possibly hundreds of lectures previously is invited to give an inaugural lecture. But it's an inaugural lecture because this time, for the first time, Richard will be presenting to friends, family, loved ones, his greatest supporters, and presenting as a professor. We have many reasons to be proud of Richard. He is a Vic alumnus. He gained his bachelor's and master's here in science in the 1990s. He completed his PhD at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln in the US, and at the same time as completing a PhD in geosciences, completed a Master's of Science Teaching. And Richard gives great credit to his parents for encouraging graduate studies, as back in the 90s, Kiwis, shall we say, might not have been supportive of graduate studies when you could go out and get a real job, because let's face it, where's a PhD going to take you? In this case, it took Richard in the first instance to Nebraska, where he not only got a PhD, he met Amy, who was to become his wife. She was studying for her degree in psychology. Now, Richard tells this story. Amy worked in a brew pub that he and his mates from geology would frequent, and Amy anonymously sent him a tasty alt beer while she was working one evening. And it was at that point, as Richard said in his own words, that he knew something was going to happen. Well, something clearly did, at least twice, and their daughters are here tonight, Sophia and Maya. Welcome, and it's great for you to be here supporting your dad. Richard freely admits that his time away in the field has sometimes put pressure on the family, but Amy has always been supportive and acknowledged the importance of his work. And now our Professor Levy is a glacial stratigrapher. That doesn't mean he's a very slow-moving stratigrapher. It means he's a stratigrapher of glaciers, and a paleoclimatologist with an expertise in microfossil analysis. He uses this expertise to reveal the evolution of Earth's climate over the past 40 million years. Rather more recently than that, his work has focused on predicting sea level change and its impacts on Aotearoa and the world. Richard's list of research achievements is too long to detail here, but includes being co-leader of the Melting Ice Rising Seas team that won the Prime Minister's Science Prize in 2019. And in 2023, he received a Sir Peter Blake Award for leadership. Amongst his many current research projects, he is co-chief scientist of an ambitious international project that will drill through the Ross Sea ice shelf, which doesn't sound dodgy at all, and into the sediments below the sea floor. And he will head off to Antarctica to lead a large team of engineers, drillers, and scientists in November this year. That'll be his 15th visit to the Antarctic. Richard isn't just ours to claim. We share him with GNS, where he was recently appointed the Chief Science Advisor. And along with colleagues at GNS, he has developed GeoCamp and Te Kura Whenua. These are community-focused science education initiatives, and between them have received several awards. I think this reflects his passion for teaching and science communication, and he works hard to help New Zealanders of every age engage in climate change issues and solutions. In this, his inaugural lecture, we will be amongst his students as he takes us on a journey to explore the fascinating world of the Antarctic and the geological records hidden beneath the ice that inform sea level science. As such, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Levy.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a tātou katoa. Nau mai haere mai i te whānau, nau mai haere mai e hoa mā, whakatau mai rā. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks very much, Professor James, for that introduction. I'm going to embellish upon some of the things you've already said as I give my presentation tonight. Thanks to all for coming along this evening. It really is a thrill to see so many family and friends here in the audience. And I'm really rather nervous as I usually speak to a somewhat anonymous audience who are not as likely to give me honest feedback once I'm done. And to those of you I don't yet know, I hope you enjoy the evening, and I look forward to talking to you if we get a chance following my presentation. This evening I will share with you some of my experiences in Antarctica. Really rather a spectacular place, as you can see from the image I took from the Freeze Hills looking towards the vast expanse of the East Antarctic Ice Sheet. Kaua e kōrero te reka o te kumara. This whakatauki simply states that a kumara never speaks of its sweetness and captures the discomfort many of us feel when asked to speak about ourselves. But my American family and 15 years living in the middle of the United States has taught me that it's okay to be proud and to poke your head above the poppies every now and then. So bear with me as I talk a little bit about my personal journey this evening. Of course, I plan to focus on my Antarctic adventures and suspect that's what many of you have come here to hear about. I will also talk briefly about the sea level research that I've been doing with colleagues across our country. I will touch on some of the really cool community outreach initiatives that I've been involved in over the years, and we'll finish with an intro to our exciting Swayze to Sea project on the Ross Ice Shelf. Now, I'm going to apologise now for going over time, as there is a lot to say and I found it really difficult to cut things out, so apologies. Mana huru huru ka reri te manu. With many feathers the bird will fly. To my family and friends who have supported me over the years, and to all my colleagues who have been instrumental in the work I'm about to present, I thank you. None of this can be done alone. So I was born in Lower Hutt in 1968, a couple of months before Cyclone Giselle met a cold front from the Antarctic. My mum tells a story of having to drive down from the heights of Kelson to avoid 150 mile per hour winds that tore roofs from houses across the region that day. The wahine ran aground and lives were lost. The concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide on this day, when an incredibly rare but devastating storm hit Wellington, was 325 parts per million. Later that same year, 3 humans flew to the moon for the first time. Astronaut William Anders took this iconic image of Earth rising above the lunar horizon, giving us all a clear view of our fragile planet with its swirling interconnected atmosphere, oceans and ecosystems. Anders passed away earlier this month, but what a life to live, one at the forefront of discovery. I grew up in Masterton, and in 1986 made my way back to Wellington to study architecture here at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga Waka. I met some great friends, maybe they weren't so great, but I met some great friends and had a fantastic time, but study didn't go so well. I missed so many lectures that my rather poor exam performance meant I had to change direction. I returned in 1987 to study geology. Atmospheric CO2 concentration was 345 parts per million. By the 1990s, I was pretty hooked on geoscience and embarked on my master's degree, choosing to study igneous rocks in the Clarence Valley in Marlborough. My dad ventured into the hills with me as my field assistant, climbing hills and filling his backpack with rocks. I'm really truly grateful to my parents, Jackie and Keith, both of whom are here tonight. When many people around me suggested that getting a job was a better option, Mum and Dad backed me and supported me as I continued to chase a not so clear but really engaging path. In 1991, our atmospheric CO2 concentration was 356 parts per million. In 1993, I was offered the chance of a lifetime, a trip to Antarctica with a young Gary Wilson and my soon to be PhD advisor David Harwood. Upon return from the Deep South, I headed to the large, expansive flatness of the Midwest United States and to study at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Atmospheric CO2 was 357 parts per million. When I arrived in the US, sorry girls, sorry about that. When I arrived in the US, I thought I was destined to drink horrendous American beer for the foreseeable future. Lucky for me, there was an excellent craft brewery in town. Perhaps even luckier for me, this brewery is where I met my wife, Amy. Amy is here tonight with our two daughters, Sophia and Maya. Amy, you and the girls have always told me that the work I do is important, and for that I am grateful. The support, encouragement, and love you have given me over the years is the primary reason I am able to stand here tonight and offer this inaugural lecture. Now, I show these two photos to make a couple of points. This is Sophia at Christmas in 2003. I think it's a little dinosaur on her pajamas. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations were 376 parts per million at this time, 50 parts per million higher than in the year I was born. This photo also shows that I refused to give up my architectural dreams and built Soph an exact replica of Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie to include a Barbie Volkswagen in the garage, or garage, as I would have said back then. I also wanted to say thanks to you all for letting me drag you to geological sites that were off the beaten path, on this occasion to walk in the footsteps of dinosaurs in the middle of Wyoming. When we visited this site, 2010, atmospheric CO2 concentration was 390 parts per million. I was in India last week. On May 29th, atmospheric CO2 concentrations were 427 parts per million. And a new record temperature of 49.9 degrees Celsius was set in New Delhi. It is unequivocal. The burning of fossil fuels has driven CO2 to levels that are unprecedented in human history. Between 1968, the year of the Wahine disaster and the Apollo 8 mission, and today, CO2 has climbed over 100 parts per million. Earth's average temperature has risen 1.2 degrees C over the past century, and climate records are being broken across our planet. Sea level has risen by 20 centimetres on average across the planet and will continue to rise. Much of the research that my colleagues and I are currently conducting is focused on predicting just how much sea level will rise in the future and how this change will affect coastal communities around the world. But to understand how our planet's ice sheets will change in the future, we often look to the past. I have spent much of my career looking to Earth's geological record to examine how the Antarctic ice sheets responded to past intervals of environmental variability and climate change. And for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I want to share some examples of this research with you. I'm going to focus on two key time intervals, the Eocene-Oligocene transition and the mid-Miocene climate transition. These will be on the test at the end. Episodes where large environmental changes are recorded in a range of geological archives. These episodes also record shifts in atmospheric CO2 that likely represent thresholds in the climate system across which we see fundamental changes in our Earth system. Now I'm going to go off script because I just wanted to write all that stuff down so I got it nailed, right? So now bear with me. I'm going to go back into my free mode, which is sometimes dangerous. Before we get too much further, a little bit of a geography lesson for those of you that aren't entirely aware of Antarctica. The map on your left is a map of Antarctica, and it highlights that it's divided into two pretty distinct areas, West Antarctica and East Antarctica, the East Antarctic Ice Sheet and the West Antarctic Ice Sheet sitting there on this landmass. Now, if we were to have a magic ability to remove the ice sheet from Antarctica, what the continent would look like is that map on your right. It shows areas in blue that would sit today below sea level. These are marine areas, and where the ice sits on the ground in those regions, we call them marine-based ice sheets. those parts of the Antarctic ice sheet are most vulnerable to warming because they're sensing and feeling the warming oceans that we're experiencing today. The colours in greens and oranges and yellows are areas that would be above land. Now, I'm also going to try to give you a very, very quick and brief lesson in how we use our understanding of the modern system, of how the modern ice sheets and the environments that sit around them and beneath them, what types of sediments are in those environments, how we use that to help us reconstruct change through time. So this is an image showing, it's a photograph across Antarctica, and in the distance you see parts of the ice sheet that are sitting on land below the ice. So that's what we call a grounded ice sheet. It's actually sitting on land. At some point, that grounded ice sheet starts to float and form an ice shelf. And this is actually still directly connected to the grounded ice sheet, but it's starting to float out onto the ocean, these regions of the ice shelves. Sea ice forms seasonally around the continent, melts mostly in the summer and then forms again in the winter, and that's what we call sea ice. And then the open ocean is, of course, areas that are ice-free. If we were to make a slice through that image that I just showed, this is sort of what it would look like. You can see the land, the bedrock, here in brown, coming into this point here, which is called the grounding zone, where the grounded ice, the ice sheet here, starts to float and form that ice shelf. And again, floating sea ice here. Now, if we were to go to the ground and look at the types of sediment that are forming in these environments, these are the types of differences we would see, the different types of sediments we would see. If I was to dive down to the seafloor in the open marine setting, I'm going to see sediments that form in an open marine, under open marine conditions, often comprised of marine algae, things that live in the open ocean. If we were to swim in closer to the grounding zone, beneath the ice shelf, you're going to see sediments that look more like this, sub-ice shelf sediments. And if we were able to dig down and pop our heads up right beneath the ice sheet, the grounded ice sheet, and look at the types of sediments that were forming, we'd see things that look like this, these diamictites. And so, as geologists, we're always looking for stratigraphic sections where rocks are stacked one on top of the other. And these are the types of things we might see. A subglacial sediment with a sub-ice shelf sediment stacked on top of it, with an open marine sequence or sediment type stacked on top of that a sub-ice shelf sediment, and then a subglacial sediment again. And what that sequence of rocks is showing us is a cycle of glacial advance, retreat, and advance. So at the bottom, the ice is sitting over the spot on Earth that we're interested in. The ice retreats, it becomes an ice shelf, retreats again, open ocean, and then you get another advance. So it's these cycles of advance and retreat that we can decipher by looking at these sediments. That's pretty much what I've done for a living. We can also add other clues to help us interpret the past. This is a picture, a rather beautiful picture, of a diatom. This is the shell of a marine algae, a type of marine algae. When we find these things, it helps us understand a little bit more about the environment, what the temperature was in the ocean, how far away we were from the ice, were we in truly open ocean conditions or in areas that were occupied by sea ice. So using these microorganisms and the sediments in which they're contained, we can start to reconstruct the history of Antarctica. Now, it's unfortunately not so simple as just going down to Antarctica, finding these rocks and doing our work, because this ice covers most of the continent. This is a photograph I took last season flying from New Zealand down to Antarctica out the window of the Hercules, and it's beautiful, right? These amazing ice-covered, snow-covered mountains with glaciers flowing through the mountain, stunningly beautiful views, but the ice covers the damn rocks, and we want to see the rocks. So we want to get rid of the ice so we can see the rocks, but we don't want to get rid of the ice because that causes sea level to rise. So it's a real challenge. There are places around Antarctica that are ice-free. This is an example, again, of a fairly stunning landscape taken from a helicopter in the upper parts of the Wright Valley in the Transantarctic Mountains. This is a location called the Labyrinth for fairly obvious reasons. And the rocks that are exposed in these mountains are old. They are too old, really, for the time interval that I'm interested in studying. These are 460 to 176 million years old. We want to find the younger rocks to help us understand the more recent history. Now, glaciers have this ability to ground out rocks at their base and bring them to the surface. Just like a bulldozer might bring rocks to the surface as it plows through the ground, glaciers can do the same thing. So we have to be creative. We use the fact that ice can actually grab rocks from beneath, bring them to the surface where we can actually study them. These rocks that are young enough but buried beneath the ice, bring them to the surface so that we can study them and start to try to piece together the history of Antarctica. And that's what I did for much of my PhD and subsequent studies. This is an image taken in 2010. Steve Bohardy, a longtime colleague, did a master's at University of Nebraska. I've kept in touch with him ever since. And Gary Wilson, sitting there, who I've worked with for many years, and was the person who, of course, originally invited me down to Antarctica. So many thanks to Gary. But in the distance, you can see all of these boulders scattered across the surface. These are erratics that have been ground out from beneath the ice and dumped at the surface through this glacial erosion and depositional process. And so if you walk around and look at the ground long enough and hard enough, you can find rocks and pick up those rocks, crack them open, find out what's in them, and start to piece together the history of the continent that is otherwise hidden. And what's quite amazing is some of these rocks, when you crack them open in the field, like this one here, you find fossil leaves, right? So this is a fossil leaf impression from one of these boulders that we cracked open. This thing here is a crab claw. You can see the crab claw in a burrow. Just cracking these rocks open, seeing these fossils, it's quite remarkable. It's kind of like Christmas. Maybe not such a great Christmas, but it's kind of like Christmas. And then you also, if you start to process these rocks, you can find these tiny microfossils. These are dinoflagellate cysts that help us understand the age and the environment in which the rocks were deposited. These are microfossils, and even shark's teeth. We've found crocodile teeth, we've found bird bones, all sorts of things in these rocks. The problem is they're all jumbled up and they're out of order. So you've got to try and jigsaw puzzle them back together to get some sense of what the environment was like in the past. You can also study the sediments. Again, here you can see some examples of rocks cut into thin section with a mollusk in it, in this case, these sandstones. But you also find rocks that are diamictites that indicate glacial activity. So we put all of these things together, and what we were able to show was that all of the rocks that are older than 34 million years ago, these Eocene-aged rocks, are the ones that show warmth. Fossil leaves, crabs, all of those warm things. And the ones that are typically diamictite post-date 33 million years. And so we've crossed that Eocene-Oligocene transition where we've gone from 1,000 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere to less than 800 parts per million, and we've grown ice sheets. And so it suggests that there's a threshold in the system, a CO2 threshold in the system, across which you go from trees, no ice, lots of ice. Problem is it's not in a stratigraphic order. So another way to get to the rocks beneath the ice is to drill. And in the early 2000s, I got brought into the Antarctic geological drilling program, which was a real major step in my career. It pushed me back in a direction that ultimately ended up bringing me back home. And just want to acknowledge, this was the first time I met Tim Nash, who again is in the room today. And this was sort of the start of, I don't want to get too cheesy here, Tim. This was the start of a very long partnership that we've had. We've done a hell of a lot of things together in the Antarctic that's ultimately led to us developing and driving a lot of the sea level rise research that's been pretty critical for Aotearoa New Zealand. So thanks, Tim. We'll continue the work, but it was great to meet you back then, and we'll keep on going. Andrew was able to drill beneath the ice and get those rocks that where they're all jumbled up and all out of sequence. We could actually get them in sequence, bring them to the surface by drilling. And I wanted to put this up here just to make people groan a little bit, because this is the sort of stuff I deal with on a relatively routine basis. Putting wiggles together on pieces of paper, trying to bring all the geological data we're collecting from these rocks together to help us interpret the past. And in a nutshell, what came out of this work, this Andrew SMS project looking at the Miocene, was that when we had times when CO2 was well above 400 parts per million, we tended to have ice sheets and evidence that ice sheets that look like this. So no marine-based ice sheets, just terrestrial ice sheets, so smaller than today when CO2 was just above 400 parts per million, no marine ice sheets. And when we drop below 400 parts per million, we see evidence for these marine-based ice sheets. So it tends to suggest there's a threshold in the system at 400 parts per million, below which we have large marine-based ice sheets, above which we lose our marine-based ice sheets and start to shrink the terrestrial ice sheets, which tends to suggest there's a high sensitivity to CO2 in the system. Now, when we model those data, and I certainly don't model, I'm not a modeler, but we work with modelers, a couple of faces of people that I've worked with here and just want to acknowledge them, Ed Gasson, Dave Pollard and Rob DeConto, ran these models again and showed that even in the models, this 400 parts per million threshold, somewhere between 580, you have no marine-based ice sheets, and at 280 you have marine-based ice sheets. So it tends to suggest there's this sensitivity in that system. If you think about that, we're at 427 parts per million today, right? So we've gone above that threshold. These are all marine records offshore. In 2014, we were lucky enough to team up with Adam Lewis, a professor at North Dakota State University, who had done a lot of work in the transantarctic mountains, hunting for these very rare terrestrial outcrops of relatively young rocks. And this is the Taylor Glacier and the Freeze Hills, and right up on top here is a little deposit of Miocene, or a fairly extensive deposit of Miocene age. And Adam had said to us, he knew we were pretty good at drilling, and so he said, why don't you guys come into the field and drill this for us? And so we went in with Webster Drilling, acknowledging Tony Kingan. I've worked with him since Andrew days, and Alex Pine, whom I have known since I was an undergraduate, in the field, helping us drill these records with Tim, Hannah Chorley, Adam Lewis, and a bunch of others, Nick Gollage involved in this project, to recover these records, these terrestrial records, through that 400 parts per million transition. And this is really cool too. We get these rocks back, we bring them back to Aotearoa, and then we take them to the nearest medical facility. So we rock up to these hospitals with boxes full of rocks and ask if we can pass them through the CT scanner. We have to pay for this, it's not cheap, but the radiographers always say they really enjoy this because it's better than just scanning bones all the time. So they get to scan these rocks. And what you're seeing here is a CT scan of one of the cores from the Freeze Hills, going from a diamictite into these layered sediments that are water lane, into so a lake or a river and a lake system, and then up through the sequence and back into the glacial sediments again. So another one of these glacial cycles. But what's really key about this is it shows there's a lot of water around, where today there's none. You can dig into these rocks and pull out things like this, little bits from plants, diatoms. You can see a fossil leaf here again, a Nothofagus leaf from these sequences. Pollen and spores that tell us these sorts of plants here grew in the Freeze Hills back in the Miocene when CO2 was above 400 parts per million. So much warmer, much wetter, much more vegetation when CO2 was above 400 parts per mil. Just to sort of emphasize that, this is what the environment looks like today. This is the Holocene today. CO2 is 280 parts per million, and the mean summer temperature up in the Freeze Hills is minus 13 degrees Celsius. Pretty chilly, not atypical for Antarctica. And this is what it was like when those rocks that we drilled, this is what the environment would have been like at the time that those rocks were being deposited. Middle Miocene interglacial, carbon dioxide above 400 parts per million, mean summer temperature 4 to 6 degrees, so almost 20 degrees warmer than today, and lots of vegetation and water. So a very different environment. Again, suggesting that the Antarctic system is sensitive to this threshold around 400 parts per million. All right. That's hopefully given you a bit of a taste of what we do in the Antarctic to try to understand how the ice sheet responds to climate forcing, to how the ice sheets might respond to these CO2 thresholds. But of course, what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay in Antarctica. And as the ice sheet is warming, as the climate is warming today and the ice sheets are starting to melt, that water goes into the ocean and is causing sea level to rise. And so about a number of years ago now, Tim and I we were lying in our tent in Antarctica, discussing, what was the thing that we should really be focusing on. And Tim was adamant, we've got to focus more on the effects of Antarctica in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And so put together a big project to try to better understand how sea level will change in the future. And we were lucky enough to get funding for that and start the New Zealand Sea Rise program Te Taipare o Aotearoa, which is also now morphed into another version where we're looking at hazards related to sea level rise called Te Ao Hurihuri Te Aho. When you talk to New Zealanders and you talk about Antarctica, they're somewhat fascinated by it. But what really matters to them is how is change in Antarctica going to affect us here in New Zealand? How much will sea level rise, how soon, and how will it affect the things I care about. So what we did, we said, right, there's a lot of work that's gone on globally to try to understand how Antarctica will change in the future, how the glaciers will retreat in the future, how the oceans are warming and expanding, causing sea level to rise. We don't need to reinvent that wheel because there's a lot of people all around the world doing really awesome work trying to figure that out. And it was all compiled most recently in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report 6. So that information was available to us. But what we realised was that there are many local effects that matter that can cause sea level to rise faster or slower. So these local effects can really impact your local communities, and that's what we chose to focus on, bringing that regional information together with the local information to provide location-specific, relevant sea level projections for people in Aotearoa. Vertical land movement is the key local effect that can impact sea level rise. All around our coastline right now, it's moving. I'm not talking just during earthquakes, it's moving as we speak right now. The Wellington region in general is going down at about 2 to 3 millimetres per year as I'm standing here speaking. And in areas where the land is sinking or subsiding, that causes sea level to rise faster, right? So climate's causing the ice sheets to melt, causing sea level to rise globally, but that land dropping accelerates the rate of sea level rise. Of course, in areas where the land is going up, it slows down the rate of sea level rise. So knowing this, if you're a planner, is really, really important because it helps you forecast and adapt to future change with more certainty. We pulled all of this information together and working with a group up in Auckland, Takiwa, produced a series of maps that can be accessible online to anyone. And what those maps show is the amount that sea level will rise at any location around our coastline spaced 2 kilometres apart. And you can look at both the sea level rise without vertical land movement, or you can turn vertical land movement on to get the rate of sea level rise. So you can experiment. You can see the different effect of the different influences on sea level rise and use that in your planning. This tool gained a lot of attention, mostly positive. And we've actually just gone through a second release about a week ago to update our data. But feedback has been that this has been really a useful tool to have. Now, knowing just how much sea level will rise is really important. Mean sea level will rise is really important. But what I know a lot of people don't really appreciate is that relatively small amounts of sea level rise can have a big effect. So often I'll give talks at various fora, and you might say sea level is going to rise 10 centimetres, 20 centimetres, 30 centimetres, and people sort of go, well, that's really not that much, don't have to worry. But colleagues at NIWA have shown that a 30 centimetre sea level rise in Wellington turns what is today a rare event, a rare 1 in 100 year event, something that doesn't happen very often, into something that's going to happen every year, just 30 centimetres of sea level rise. So something like the Wahine storm, Cyclone Giselle in 1968, which was a very rare event, it caused a lot of flooding. Now that rare event, we're not going to get necessarily a whole bunch more Wahine scale storms, but with a little bit of sea level rise, what it means is those smaller storms will have the same flooding effect that the Wahine storm had. So it's that slight increase in mean sea level turns these smaller events into events that today have a fairly significant flooding impact because our infrastructure is not built to handle those. Some of the storms will get bigger because we're putting more energy into the atmosphere. There's more water in the atmosphere. Those storms will get bigger. But it's that small increase in sea level rise that causes the problem. And just bear with me. I've used this example a number of times, and hopefully it helps you understand the concept I was just trying to speak to. Imagine you're a basketball player, or let's consider a basketball player in the NBA. I'm told, and if you do a Google search, they generally can jump about 60 centimetres off the ground. And if your threshold, the thing that you have to breach in order to, in this case, dunk the basketball, is the hoop, and you jump off the ground 60 centimetres, then you may only dunk once every 10 attempts. just because it's hard, right? The threshold is quite high. Of course, if you start pouring a whole bunch of polyurethane or varnish on the floor of the gym and you start causing the gym to rise slightly, every time you jump, it's now easier to dunk that ball, right? You've just raised the floor slightly, you're jumping the same height, but now you're able to dunk much more easily because you're able to breach that threshold. If the hoop sinks, if you lower the hoop, you're lowering the threshold, your floor's higher, you're going to dunk more frequently. And then if you train a whole bunch more, eat a whole bunch more food and energy, you can jump that little bit higher, you're going to be dunking every time. So you kind of see where this is going, right? So sea level rise just means that it's much easier for that wave to breach the protection. You don't have to make the wave bigger, it's just that it's easier to breach the seawall. If you sink the seawall or you sink the coastal infrastructure by vertical land movement, again, that wave doesn't have to work so hard to breach the threshold and flood. So this is why small amounts of sea level rise have a big effect. All right. Anxiety and concern. Effective education, outreach and communication is key. I was looking for a head in the sand picture the other day, and I was thinking I was going to use an ostrich, but this one came up. These are climate activists that around the world. They did this recently. I think it's brilliant, right? Don't stick your head in the sand and ignore the problem. But the challenge is if you put your head up and you listen and you try to understand the problem, it creates can create quite a lot of anxiety. And I get a lot of feedback, we all get a lot of feedback about how anxious people are feeling about climate change and the challenges it brings. But our tenet is that if you help people understand the problem, if you give them information, avoid disinformation, provide them with the power and tools to help understand and grapple with the problem, then you might have a chance to reduce that anxiety slightly. And we're working with folk to try to actually test whether or not that's true. But so one of the things I've been working on is trying to bring my teaching skill set. As Bryony mentioned, I trained as a teacher in Nebraska, and I spent one year only in a middle school and had children young men throwing chairs across my classroom, and you really learn to manage people. So GNS and VUW, it's easy. It really is. It was really an experience and a half. But learning the skills to actually teach and try to convey information was valuable to me. And I've done research with educational specialists around the world just to test how our techniques could be improved or whether or not they work. And when I came back to New Zealand, I was able to hook up with Kyle Bland, Joe Preble and Julian Thompson and develop something we called GeoCamp, which was taking the skill set in teaching, the knowledge I had in teaching, and applying it to the kids in New Zealand and bring their teachers along to try to help their teachers also learn about geoscience by actively going out into the field. And we generally get really positive response. These are 3 rangatahi up in Northland, sitting on the beach, taking notes, and they actually were taking notes about the rocks, which is pretty remarkable. Doing things like this is, we tell the students, let's go out and build some sandcastles, and they think, okay, that sounds cool. This isn't really learning, but then we secretly get them to use a tape measure and draw contour lines around the sandcastle. And so they get the concept of elevation and the height change on a feature they've built themselves. And then if you take the photograph from the side and then on top, and you tell them, well, now look at a map, this is what you're seeing when you're looking at contour lines. Again, linking that to sea level rise and trying to understand elevation change and really engaging the students and trying to understand the problems and the challenges with climate change. An image here just bringing the Antarctic to the classroom. It's not always easy, right? But melting lots of ice. I've melted lots of blocks of ice with kids around the country. Again, helping them understand the difference between grounded ice sheets, floating ice. Grounded ice sheets affect sea level when they melt. Floating ice has very little impact. Just getting them to understand the difference between the two, and also understand the fact that when an ice sheet melts, sea level goes up. Lots of opportunity to do things like that. Also had the privilege to work with various iwi, hapu, Māori around the country. This is one example of a kura whenua that we ran a number of years ago. Again, bringing those teaching skills, bringing that understanding of Antarctica, bringing that understanding of geology and climate change to Māori groups in a marae setting. sleeping on the marae, immersing ourselves in the community, getting really positive feedback that we're actually committed to trying to help the communities understand the challenge. Then finding that the aunties are then also really keen to teach the mokopuna themselves. So once we leave, there's that ongoing ability to teach the communities. So this is the sort of stuff we want to continue doing in our changing coast, working with communities around the country, helping them understand what we've learned about sea level rise and climate change, so that they're empowered with accurate knowledge and can make decisions moving forward, and hopefully mitigate some of the challenges that come and increased anxiety through lack of understanding and lack of knowledge. Almost done. Where are we today? This is a graph, another graph. I've managed to avoid graphs for the most part, so you're welcome. This is a temperature curve showing temperature increasing, and the key point with this particular curve is that it's highlighting that we're on track to exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels within the next 5 years or so. We came pretty close this year. I think it got up to about 1.4 degrees above pre-industrial levels and then dropped down again. But within the next 5 years, it's expected we will breach 1.5 briefly, partly because of El Nino, the current El Nino cycle that we're in. But we're definitely on track to 1.5 by the early 2030s. And this is not good news for the planet. This is that key Paris target. So what does 1.5 degrees C mean for Antarctica? And just a little call out to Nick Gollage here, whom I've also worked with over the years. He's been a great colleague, introduced me to modelling through a bunch of really complex mathematical formulas at me in one of the first papers we wrote together. I read it and checked for grammar. Wasn't very helpful with the math. I didn't get to tell him that was what I actually failed in my first year at Vic when I was doing architecture. But anyway, but Nick had done this study that was published, really quite a seminal study. And what this diagram shows you, and what these model outputs show you, is that under RCP 2.6, under a scenario that keeps us close to the Paris Agreement, an emissions scenario that keeps us close to the Paris Agreement, we can actually save the Ross Ice Shelf. Here's the Ross Ice Shelf here. 2100, 2300, you see the ice shelf sticks around. Antarctica still melts slightly, and by 2300, just from Antarctica and just in this model experiment, you still get 20-some centimetres out of Antarctica, plus whatever the oceans are doing, plus whatever the glaciers are doing. So it's more than that. But you're keeping the Antarctic contribution to a fairly low number. If we follow the current pathway we're on, RCP 4.5 is essentially what we're tracking along now in terms of emissions. By 2300, the Ross Ice Shelf is gone, and you're closer to a metre from Antarctica alone. Again, you've got to add it to everything else that's causing sea level to rise around the world. So save the ice shelves is the message from the models. But we also don't really have enough evidence yet from Antarctica to say whether or not 1.5 degrees is a threshold, whether or not it might be 2 degrees, it might be slightly warmer, we might have a little bit more time. So we've embarked on this project, the Space 2C project, to look at the sensitivity of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet to a Paris target. And the fundamental question is, will the Ross Ice Shelf and West Antarctic Ice Sheet collapse when temperature exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius? We want to go out to the grounding zone to find some geological records from a time in Earth's past when we know temperatures were about 1 to 1.5 degrees to see whether or not the Ross Ice Shelf was there or not. And that sort of gives us the geological evidence to support some of the modelling. I think if you asked Tim to answer that question, he would say yes. Yeah, he's nodding right there. Anyway, we're going regardless, and it's a pretty awesome international project involving many people. And there we go. And we actually went out last year and was trying to drill all the way to get the records, but we had some technical challenges, managed to get some of the data, but we have to go back next year. But this is just to give you a sense of the scale of the project. The big red drill tent in the front there, lots of equipment to tow things around, drill equipment, camp in the background there on the far right. Rather an impressive coming together of logistics, engineering and science to try to get to this record beneath the ice shelf to give us that maybe more compelling answer to that question of just how sensitive is the Ross Ice Shelf to warming. And on that, I wanted to finish with this image, thinking back to to the moonrise and the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. This is, I've always found this quite phenomenal, right, that we were able to send people to the moon and land people on the moon and collect geological samples from the moon. And I just wanted to point out that there are more samples, we've collected more samples from the moon than we have from West Antarctica. We know more about the subsurface geology of the moon than we do the grounding zone of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. So in terms of discovery, in terms of exploration, this is an amazing place that's in our backyard that we still know so little about. So going back and trying to find these rocks, I guess, is our moonshot for my lifetime. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you learned a little bit about Antarctica, Antarctic research, a little bit about my life, and I hope you get a sense for just how important the work is we do, and thanks again for all your support.
Tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Ko Margaret Highland toko ingoa, ko te tumu maru arangi ke te herenga waka o e Mahiana. Good evening, my name's Margaret Highland. I'm the DVC research here at Te Herenga Waka, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be proposing this vote of thanks for our colleague, Professor Richard Levy. And despite appearances, I'm not really much of a traditionalist, but this tradition of the inaugural lecture is one that I really love and I really support. It's our chance to celebrate our new professors, a chance to hear from our passionate people about the work that they do. And so in that vein, it's great to see everybody here tonight to support and to celebrate Richard and his achievements. So good to see your family here, Richard, your colleagues, our colleagues at your other workplace, GNS, because of course we share Richard with GNS, or they share him with us. Colleagues at the Antarctic Research Center, my colleagues in Tahiwa, and colleagues just from around the university. Good to see you here. So in this inaugural lecture, Richard has cogently, eloquently, passionately, and I think imaginatively demonstrated how the Earth's past natural experiments provide important clues as to how the Antarctic ice sheets will respond to elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide. Because, of course, the behavior of these ice sheets is such a critical driver of climate systems, they can point towards the probable future effects of the climate change. So put another way, and mixing metaphors, the time machine that is the geological record is also a crystal ball to look into the future. And by examining those threshold levels, like the mid-Miocene 400 ppm CO2, do I get a tick? Thank you. Those are the conditions that trigger change. We can also understand a bit about the likelihood of future melting or future refreezing of those ice sheets and their effect on climate. One of Richard's colleagues described him as being genuinely interested in understanding how the world works, and I think we saw that tonight in the kind of joy of discovery of what the rocks reveal. And as a truly curiosity-driven researcher. But it's also clear that although genuine curiosity may be one motivator for Richard and his work, it's also clear that he's really driven by making a difference. And this means that he's had to do some things that strike fear into the heart of many scientists, and that is step beyond your narrow field of expertise, to go out to talk to policymakers, to engage with communities. And I speak as a lap scientist, by the way, so I know that this can be a real challenge for many of us, but it's something, as we can see, that Richard has really embraced. And I suspect that in part that's your slightly less than conventional pathway into research that's given you some of the skills and experience to draw on that's allowed you to do that. So both your time in industry and obviously your teaching experience and your passion for teaching comes through there too. And he's had to do two things beyond the just basic research. One is to take that basic research and help understand the implications of it for the world, for New Zealand now. And that means that you have to bring other people in to help you understand what the implications are. And then communicate that. And we saw some beautiful examples, both of how Richard communicates with, the basketball dunking comparison, really explaining what the implications are and why it's important. And explaining those to broad groups from the public, also to decision makers, so that they can use the insights from this work to help us manage, mitigate, and adapt to the future that's coming. One thing that may not have come out as clearly as it should, so it's a great chance that I get to talk about this, is that one of Richard's superpowers is bringing together and leading teams. And I'm really in awe of that skill. Last year I had the pleasure of spending a couple of hours with Richard and some of the team just before they were going down to the Antarctic to do fieldwork for the Sways 2C project. Over dinner, I chatted with Richard and one of his co-chief scientists on the program, Tina van der Vliet, about how they work together. And through the course of the conversation, I came to see how really critical teamwork is to the success of the science. And I thought I knew about teamwork because as an engineer, we do a lot of work in teams. But I didn't have to share a tent with my team, or spend 24 hours a day, 8 weeks in an isolated environment. So, what I came to realize is that a highly functioning team is arguably as important a component of their scientific methodology as a multi-million-dollar drilling rig. It's not a nice to have, it's really essential. And so the kinds of skills that Richard has in pulling those teams together, very diverse teams, and making them work is really exceptional. And with there, I will close. This is a wonderful moment of celebration for us and a real pleasure for me to offer this vote of thanks today. In a minute, we're going to go into the Hunter Common Room for some refreshments, but first I ask you all to join me in showing our gratitude and celebrating Professor Richard Levy.